Hello, and welcome to this installment of the Future Grind podcast. I'm your host, Ryan O'Shea, and today I'll be speaking with Dr. James Hughes. James is a bioethicist and serves as the executive director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, which he founded alongside Nick Bostrom in 2004. Dr. Hughes is the author of Citizen Cyborg, Why Democratic Societies Must Respond to the Redesigned Human of the Future, and has previously served as executive director of the World Transhumanist Association, which is now known as Humanity Plus. James is well known for his contributions to the Technoprogressive movement and was previously a Buddhist monk. We discuss ideas for the regulation of transformative technologies, the controversies around brain augmentation, and question whether or not we should bring other animals into society by increasing their intelligence. It's a wide-ranging and very interesting conversation. As always, show notes and links are available at futuregrind.org. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, and wherever podcasts are found. A video version of this episode is posted on Facebook and YouTube. Make sure to subscribe on all of these platforms, leave a review, and you can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. If you'd like to keep this podcast running, you can donate at futuregrind.org/support. Because of you, this is Future Grind. All right, and now we are here with James. James, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So you are a founder of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. What is that, and how did it get its start?
The organization that I and most of the people who started the IEET were a part of was the World Transhumanist Association, which got started in the late 90s in Europe. And then I got involved around the year 2000. And then we incorporated in Connecticut in the United States, and I became the first executive director. And it became a global organization. It was a global organization, but it got more formal. But when we got more formal, we started to have all the political issues of electoral politics internally. And so we had such a huge diversity because basically transhumanism, the organization's, raison d'etre, was a very thin set of agreements. We basically thought human enhancement was going to be possible, and we wanted to defend individuals' rights to have it. But beyond that, we didn't agree about a whole lot. So we had everybody from anarcho-capitalists and monarchists and Putinites to people who, like myself, on the center left, and people further left than that. So it was very fractious. And around 2005, Nick Bostrom and I, and about half of the board, we wanted to start an organization that had more of a think tank, a stable think tanky feel, and that also didn't have transhumanism in the name because there were a lot of intellectuals and policy wonks who didn't want to be associated with any kind of ism, much less transhumanism. So we started IEET, Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, took over the Journal of Transhumanism and renamed it Journal of Evolution and Technology, and did attract some fellow traveling intellectuals, and started a very successful blog, started holding conferences. And our policy agenda was in a couple different places. One was promoting what we call the longevity dividend, the notion that people living longer was actually going to be good for the state and for the economy because older people could continue to contribute and not weigh down societies with nursing costs and so forth. Most people in public policy are terrified of the aging of society. We also worked on issues like popular culture's biases against enhanced people, immortality, post-human civilization, and so forth. We did catastrophic risks work about asteroids and nuclear war and geoengineering for climate change. And we were very interested in the questions around how to deepen and expand the concept of rights, human rights. So we started to work on personhood rights for non-human animals, and then cognitive liberty and reproductive rights and so forth around the expansion of other ideas of rights. And that agenda pretty much carried us through 2015, the first 10 years of our existence. When fascism started to rise worldwide, we generally decided that that was probably, the tech futurism has its place, and I do think tech futurism is part of the reason that fascism rose, because the left was still focused on fighting the issues of the 20th century and not presenting a vision of the 21st century that was going to be sufficiently attractive. Some things that, for instance, are now called fully automated luxury socialism or communism or whatever. And so we started to work on technological unemployment and the issues around automation, work, the future of work, and so forth. And that's been a lot of the focus of the work since then.
So you mentioned there that many of the IEET projects spun out from the World Transhumanist Association, which you served as the executive director of from 2004 to 2006, and is now known as Humanity Plus.
Right.
What would you say are the differences between those organizations today?
Well, Humanity Plus actually just went through a reorganization because the people who are running it got tired of elections. like Trump, they thought, why do we need elections? So they reorganized now. It's a self-perpetuating board, and I really don't care anymore. But the organization, when we, the progressives, left that organization and started focusing on other projects. I mean, Nick Bostrom got a bunch of money and started Future of Humanity Institute, which has its own very excellent agenda. And George Dvorsky started working on IO9, and I was focusing on IEET, as were some of the others. Then we seeded World Transhumanist Association, Humanity Plus, to a group of Silicon Valley folks who were basically techno-libertarians, who were very focused on AI risk, from the singularitarian point of view. And they were not at all interested in building the kind of Fifth International that I wanted to build of transhumanists. So it's very much a kind of Silicon Valley-ish project at this point, and whatever. Anyway, that's one of the differences. But also the politics. I mean, I think what happened after 2008 was that I had made all these predictions, and other people kind of chimed along that there was going to be a new axis in politics emerging, a biopolitical axis. And on the basis of that, you could have common cause with libertarian transhumanists, libertarians, and the people like me on the left, because we agreed about some other fundamental issues that might be dividing the polity. And then the economics smacked everybody in the face in 2008. And people like Peter Thiel, with their $1 billion from tech industry, came in, and he's basically a libertarian turned fascist, and he's the principal financer of Silicon Valley transhumanism. So it puts a certain kind of fundamental damper on the ideological flexibility of organizations that are dependent on right-wing tech billionaires. You can't really call for things like Medicare for all that might be a fundamental necessity if we ever have enhancement technologies and people are worried about them not being accessible to everybody. Anyway, so the economics came to the fore, and then the rise of fascism. And so now I have been promoting for the last couple of years. Since we met in Paris in 2015, and a group of us put out the Technoprogressive Declaration. It's a statement of purpose for a new politicization, new political direction for left-leaning transhumanists around the world, and futurists and people who don't call themselves transhumanists, to really focus on building a distinctly political wing of this, what I would call, from my left background, an ideological tendency, which I think has a lot of feet. It just doesn't have a lot of money, because there aren't a lot of billionaires who are that interested yet.
That gets a lot into my next question here, and I feel that a lot of people that are aware of the transhumanist movement, but that don't follow it closely, often think of transhumanists as very rich, white, and male libertarians. And there are, of course, multiple people within transhumanism that meet this description, but there's much more diversity than many people realize. You, for example, approach transhumanism, as you mentioned, from a left-leaning techno-progressive point of view. You discuss this at length in your 2004 book, Citizen Cyborg, as well as in your essay, Democratic Transhumanism. Why do you feel that techno-progressive policies are the path forward for a transhumanist movement, and how will that work?
Well, So just a little bit more about my background. I got involved in, counterculture stuff when I was a teenager, Buddhism and socialism, and futurism shortly, in the midst of all that. My ideological trajectory since then has basically been a dialogue between my spirituality, my politics, and my optimism about the future. And when I got to the late 80s, I had finally gotten over my despair at the white maleness of history and started really studying intellectual history more seriously and realized that there was a long tradition since the Enlightenment of people who had the same mixture of kind of rational spirituality and progressive egalitarian politics and optimism about technology and science and reason. And that a lot of the problems I was seeing, especially in ecological politics, because I started a journal called Eco-Socialist Review, which was all about the relationship between green politics and social democratic politics. And that journal, one of the things that we were constantly talking about was that there seemed to be a lot of Greens who just hated people. They hated human beings, that we were a cancer on the planet. So both in that political sphere and then also in bioethics, where I began to realize that the lowest common denominator of a bioethicist was the person who just said no to everything, and that no one was ever coming out and saying, well, you know what, maybe a cure for cancer would be a good idea. Maybe it would solve a lot of problems for humanity. No, it's like a cure for cancer. It's going to cost too much. It's not going to be accessible to women and black people, whatever their complaints were. So in both spheres, I began to become a technoprogressive, just didn't have a word for it yet. And when I first encountered transhumanists, I thought, oh, great, I'll have a bunch of people to talk to this about. Nope. And the first ones I talked to were all raging anarcho-capitalists. So it took me a while to find the folks who I could have that conversation with, and I basically felt like it was intellectual archaeology, that I was going back and discovering that the first transhumanists were actually Marxists or were French revolutionaries, and that we had a long tradition of mixing the kind of techno-optimism and revolutionary futurism with an egalitarian politics. It just had to be rediscovered. That's part of what I tried to do with Citizen Cyborg, and then it's the ongoing project. I mean, I'm very involved in the American left since the last election, 2016, which really knocked my world for a loop, as did many's. So since then, we've been talking about building this ideological tendency with an explicitly political wing, and it wouldn't be a transhumanist thing. It would be maybe a cyborg socialist, is what some people in Britain actually call it.
So I'm going to outline my understanding of your plan for democratized access to augmentative technologies, and let me know if I'm getting anything wrong here. Your idea for the future would be to use taxpayer dollars to fund a universal healthcare program, which, in addition to rehabilitative, therapeutic, and preventative care, would also cover access to well-regulated augmentative technologies for life extension, cognitive enhancement, and more. Is that correct?
That is correct. But just to put it in context, is that I think one of the fundamental things that I am constantly focusing on in these debates is that these technologies are not new and the questions that they raise or pose are not novel. One of the things I argued for in Citizen Cyborg and have continued to argue for is that the line between therapy and enhancement is an illusory, socially constructed one that's constantly moving. As a consequence, even if we kept the distinction that the public healthcare system should only provide therapy and not augmentation, that line between those two is constantly changing, as we see with ADD and depression and all kinds of syndrome conditions. But yes, I do think that a far more consistent way to regulate which technologies should be covered by universal healthcare dollars is to say, what's the cost benefit of providing this to the public? If it's super expensive and super risky, I don't care whether it's a therapy or an enhancement. It shouldn't be covered by public dollars. And if it's cheap and very safe and it provides a great benefit, then I think it should be accessible through public dollars or over the counter. I mean, that's the other option, is if it's really cheap, then you don't have to provide it through public dollars. You just, like aspirin, you make it universally accessible.
Well, I could see life extension technologies easily falling under healthcare and becoming covered under a universal healthcare program. But when we get to purely aesthetic or personal preference augmentations, I begin to have my doubts. For example, someone might want to adjust their vision to include infrared, or swap out human hands in favor of tentacles, or change their skin to that of a reptile. I wouldn't necessarily classify these body modifications as healthcare, but they could still lead to that class stratification that we want to avoid. For example, they could offer advantages in certain careers or environments. Would you imagine that these types of procedures would be covered under the taxpayer-funded, government-run healthcare system, or how would we handle that?
Well, one of the talks I give is when is enhancement like a gun? And the basic point I try to make about that is that the libertarians precisely do not want to think about or talk about this question of when does a technology become a danger to the public order, a danger to the fundamental equality of citizens in a society. I used to be a big fan of the X-Men narrative that, oh, they're trying to register all the X-Men, those poor mutants. And I started to think, well, if we really did have a society where people were walking around with weapons of mass destruction inside their bodies, I'd probably want to know who they were and that they were sane. And we would probably have to have a plan B in case some of them were not nice people. So I think certain kinds of enhancements do pose a threat to public order, both because those individuals might use them in irresponsible ways, and they might pose a threat to the safety of democracy because they might make power so unequal, right? So if there were technologies like that, then absolutely, we either have to ban them, regulate them, or figure out how to quickly make them accessible to everyone. Although making things that are dangerous accessible to everyone, it's like I don't want everyone having a nuke, so we have to figure out which category it's in. But there aren't very many technologies that transhumanists advocate for that really pose that kind of threat. Cognitive enhancement right now, most of the drugs don't really increase your IQ. Some of them appear to actually have been missold because they actually over time stop working or don't, or impair your memory or whatever. So people walking around with Lex Luthor superintelligence, I don't really expect to happen anytime quickly. Access to certain kinds of computing hardware is already regulated in terms of you can't sell it to the Chinese, and the DoD will be knocking on your door if you do certain kinds of things with supercomputers. So I think most of the things that are in this category we already know about. People with cyborg limbs, you can't lift up a car with a cyborg arm. It rips your arm off, right? We don't have the ability to make people better than human yet, with very few exceptions. The cochlear implants that people have, they might be able to be tuned now to hear sound outside of the normal human spectrum, but that's not really a superpower, right? So most of the things that people worry about in terms of the radical bifurcation into super rich, super powerful people and the rest of us plebes who have to serve them in a post-neo-feudal future, I don't think it's really happening. But it would, if it does, I'm sure everyone's going to be on top of it immediately, and we will have to figure out what to do about it.
Well, you can tell us what you think we should do about it in the next question. You're doing a great job of providing a segue into the next topic here. So, I agree with you that technologies that could quickly exacerbate class divides don't really exist at this point. But I think we can both imagine a future in which they do. And I think that hugely important concepts such as morphological freedom and bodily autonomy, the idea that humans or other adequately intelligent entities should have self-determination over their own bodies, could complicate your plan for strictly regulated augmentations. You seem to be very in favor of a system similar to the current FDA, in which technologies go through lengthy testing and approval processes. However, if people are willing to fund the development of their own augmentations or life extension therapies, and assert their bodily autonomy by wanting to test them on themselves, I don't think we should stop them. And if someone wants to reverse engineer these technologies to make DIY versions of them for their own use, I don't see how we can say anything about that either. I think that this could lead to a group of people that either have the resources or knowledge to gain access to unapproved technologies, and those that have to wait for them to go through the approval process. This could still lead to that class stratification that I think we all want to avoid. Do you see a solution to this?
Well, look, let's focus on, for instance, cognitive enhancement drugs. We're getting rid of FDA classification of drugs in the United States anytime soon. I'm glad we're decriminalizing marijuana. It's always been a human rights violation to make it criminal in the first place. I think probably people should have expanded rights to use cognitive enhancement drugs and certain kinds of psychoactive substances like psychedelics. but the society's not going full legalization anytime soon. And so in that context, I think you can say, well, if a drug came along that cost $1 billion and it made you 1 billion times smarter than everybody and therefore a threat to the future of the human race, yeah, we'd probably do something about that. We'd probably try to track that down and make sure that only the right people had access to it, which, figuring out that would be a complicated question. I think there are certain kinds of, as I said, when is technology like a gun? There are certain kinds of technologies that are so dangerous that we say, look, we want the person who has access to this to be under civilian control of some kind of democratic accountability. And we want them to be well licensed, and they can easily lose access to that technology if there's any kind of mental illness or any kind of compromise in their behavior. And that's what we do with nuclear weapons, and that's what we do with tanks and all kinds of things. Technology that's in that kind of public danger category, I think we will figure out how to regulate it. It's not going to be a big stretch of the imagination. And so the things that aren't in that category, like a cognitive enhancement drug like modafinil, I think modafinil should be declassified. I think it's a relatively safe drug. Of course, we thought that about methylphenidate, some other drugs too, and they do have some side effects. But I don't think that there's evidence of a broad side effect protocol. So I think, if we were to sell modafinil over the counter, it's not going to bifurcate the human race into two species. It's going to give those who are willing to pay for it an advantage in the workplace and in their daily lives and taking care of their kids or whatever. But anything that really did pose that kind of risk, I think we could take away. Now, I think in general, public sentiment around this issue is probably shifting in a libertarian direction, and we see that with support for right to try legislation, which has now been signed in the United States, that people who are terminally ill can try anything they want. And we did that back 30 years ago with the HIV epidemic. We changed the law so that people with HIV could bring in drugs that weren't approved by the FDA if they said that their doctor thought it might be a good idea. Most of that, I think what people have forgotten, and this is like, unfortunately, some millennials have forgotten the horrors of both fascism and communism and are, waving around hammers and sickles and swastikas in ways that I find troubling. They've also forgotten why we have an FDA in the first place, right? That we had all of human history before that where shamans, on the basis of nothing, said, this will cure your ills, please give me shekels. And that continues through today. And we need some check on that. And when we look back and say, oh my God, all the, like there's that movie, the Dallas Buyers Club. Most of the stuff the Dallas Buyers Club was selling to people with HIV in 1990 did not work, right? They were desperate people. They were willing to spend every last dollar they had. I understand the condition, but it did not generate any knowledge. They were not a part of a clinical trial. If people are going to try stuff willy-nilly that hasn't been approved by the FDA, I want it to generate knowledge. So I think that's where what we need to figure out is how to move forward to give people this right to try access, but at the same time generate knowledge from that access.
I would agree with you that people selling potentially dangerous technologies with false claims should be avoided. But I don't think that that's the likely scenario here. I think that the most likely scenario would be the availability of open source information online about technologies that have shown promise, maybe in early tests or in mouse models, that people are willing to test on themselves. The majority of these experiments will likely fail. Many of them may lead to illness or death, but some percentage of them will succeed. And the person who succeeds might have a great advantage. I'm not sure how we stop this from happening. We can inform people of the dangers, but with such a high potential upside and the desire for discovery, people will still experiment. And you mentioned technologies that could bifurcate the human species. I think that gene editing technologies such as CRISPR could be a great example of that. And there are people today that are already modifying their own genes at home using CRISPR. There haven't been any noteworthy successes, but that's not to say that it won't happen. What do you think of this self-experimentation, and what do you think we can do about it?
Well, what's his name, who invented physics? Anyway, there's a long history of smart people who do stupid things to themselves, thinking that they're helping their health. People who drank mercury their entire lives, be thinking that it made them smarter and stuff, things like that. Most of the DIY CRISPR experimentation that I see going on now is dumb. It's not enhancement. It's dangerous, and encouraging people to do it is a dumb thing to do. It doesn't generate knowledge, so I just do not support that as an avenue forward. It's at best, even if people like that actually found something that worked, then they would have to go offshore and provide it in offshore clinics to rich people. And one of my favorite science fiction explorations of this theme was the TV show 4400, which was like 10 years old. And in that TV show, they had basically a drug that if you gave it to ordinary folks, half of them would die and the other half would get superpowers. And it's like, that's basically, I think that's going to happen at some point, that CRISPR thing that will be extremely risky and have extreme benefits, and we're all going to have to figure out what to do about that. Should people be able to say, yeah, I'll flip the coin and maybe half the time I'll die? We certainly don't approve any drugs like that now. The FDA process does not approve that kind of drug. So I don't think it really, to me, makes that much difference if everybody's given, the person who sells the CRISPR kit that allows that then is in the same position as someone who sells you the heroin and says, I'm not shooting you up, I'm just giving you the heroin. So I think we do need to figure this out, and it could pose those kind of risks.
One of the more interesting and controversial topics you tend to discuss is altering the human brain. We currently have drugs and therapies that are approved to treat some mental illnesses, but you've suggested taking this to the next level by adjusting undesirable personality traits or even turning off biological impulses. Many people fear that our relationship with technology is already making us, quote, less human, whatever that means. I imagine that proposing fundamental changes to the human brain is even more alarming for these people, and it raises a number of ethical questions as well as practical questions. What are the benefits and risks that you see with this type of brain augmentation?
Well, I'm on the ADD end of the spectrum here and have been since I was a kid. So one of my problems as an intellectual is keeping myself interested. I basically find the issues around neuroethics a heck of a lot more challenging than the issues around whether people should be allowed to live longer and have more physical abilities. Very few people get upset when they see somebody who's lost a limb put on a cyborg version or, a cochlear implant, except for the deaf. But so the issues around changing the brain, those really ramp up people's anxieties, and for good reason. I think those are very interesting ethical questions there. Now, for probably since we were capable of thinking about the way things could be improved, maybe 50,000 years, people have been promising that they could change things about your brain. They could make you wiser, they could make you happier, and so forth. And we found drugs, rituals, spells, all kinds of things that did something in that direction. I'm a Buddhist, whatever that means. That's the equally problematic term. But I'm a Buddhist, and Buddhism is basically, in my opinion, an ancient technology for mental transformation, one that has some relatively successful tools in its toolkit. So I see this as an ancient spiritual aspiration, changing your brain, changing your behavior, changing your moral sensibilities. We just never had that effective a set of tools. The Buddhist tools work if you can do it, but most people can't do it. And what I would like to see is all of us have the access to effective tools to make ourselves the kind of people we want to be able to stop getting angry so often at our kids and our spouse, to be more attentive citizens and not waste all our time on addictions and distractions. All the things that we would like to do about ourselves, and which we do in kind of half-assed ways with, caffeine. You get up in the morning, you think, I'm tired, I really need to do a better job at work today or take care of my kids, so I better drink a cup of coffee. And in the evening, you think, boy, if I don't have a drink, I'm going to be a really nasty person tonight, so I'm going to try to chillax. So we already do this with substances. I think probably the sphere of the exocortical modifications, by which I mean having apps and electronic homes and all kinds of automation of our environment, that we can then program with ways to remind ourselves, you were supposed to pick up a gift for your kids. That's a moral obligation. Remembering your kid's birthday is a moral obligation. Now we have electronic devices that help us do that. But in the future, we're also going to have better and better drugs and gene therapies and other things that will allow us to be less biased in our decision making. So fairness and prudent decision making is a virtue. Be more self-controlled, overcome our addictions, be more compassionate and caring and empathetic without getting burnt out. That's another part of being an empathetic person by itself can lead to disaster. You need to have the prudence to exercise in that. So I think having an integrated kind of what I call a post-human model of character development. So you say, these are the various virtues that I think are important for being a good human being. And these are my deficits and these are my strengths. And here's the drugs and devices which I could use to fill in some of the gaps. I think that's the direction things are headed, a kind of technologically enabled spirituality.
Earlier, you mentioned that we should consider when technology is like a gun. And in this case, I can imagine a future in which unaugmented humans are the gun. For example, if we were to alter our brains to get rid of things such as anger or jealousy or greed, then I imagine a non-augmented human that has a propensity for anger and violence could be seen as a danger. Again, I'm not sure I'd want to force anyone to alter their own bodies, but we also need to handle risks. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, that's a very important question because obviously, as we have evolved from being, upright squirrels to the present, our moral sensibilities have changed. At first, they were just, don't push another monkey out of the tree, don't whack another monkey over the head and take away their banana, respect the alpha monkey, our tribe's better than the next tribe, all those kinds of moral intuitions. And those are still deeply encoded in our brain. And they lead to some of the terrible things, the things that we have now decided are terrible today: racism, war, patriarchy, the oppression of women, etc. So some of our deepest mammalian moral instincts need to be excised because they are not serving our purposes anymore. And some people still valorize them in their ethical systems. Reactionary, pre-Enlightenment religious value systems still valorize those things, respect for authority and so forth. But others of them are things that we have decided through rational post-Enlightenment reflection are things that need to be enhanced. So caring for others and respecting equal diversity of opinion, a variety of values that have some roots in our mammalian consciousness. I think just as it is no longer acceptable when someone insults your manhood on the street to immediately shoot them, which used to be, you're not a good person unless you do shoot them or knock them down or challenge them to a duel or whatever. Now you're a bad person if you do try to do that. I think we need to have the same moral evolution. And that means that, yes, people who still today walk around wanting to shoot other men for kissing in public or shoot women for wearing hijabs, those people need to be criminalized, as they already are, and increasingly not acceptable.
So we're talking here about augmenting the human brain, but you've also explored the idea of augmenting the brains of other animals. And you've taken this idea of animal uplift as far as arguing that perhaps we should have an equal obligation to enhance animals as we do our fellow humans. What led you to arrive at this conclusion, and how do you see this playing out?
Well, part of what the future challenge will be is that the boundaries around human and non-human have always been fuzzy, but they're going to get fuzzier and fuzzier. There's going to be more and more liminal cases. People who have animal genes inserted into them, animals that have human genes, humans that are hybrids with machines in various ways, machines that have human characteristics. And what we've already had to deal with for a long time is that what do you do with an embryo? Between being a one-celled organism and being a live baby, we have a variety of ethical stances that we could take to what those creatures are and what rights they might have. Similarly, at the end of life, once you become permanently unconscious, your heart's still beating, we now have a category called brain death, which says, yeah, but the important part of you isn't there anymore, so we can turn off the machine. And we have to make similar kinds of decisions at all the boundary conditions around what being a human is. Part of what our position in the techno-progressive world has been influenced by Peter Singer, which argues that what's really important are two things: the ability to suffer and the capacity for personhood. And those are consciousness-based criteria for moral significance. And if you take that approach, yeah, it's pretty human-centric. There's no grounds for creating an ethical world in which rocks are the pinnacle of the ethical world. We are the creators of moral values so far in the dialogue that we've had with the universe, and therefore we are at the top, and everybody else has to be judged according to how close they get to us. I understand that there's that limitation, but given that, if we look at our immediate neighbors, we see that apes, dolphins, elephants, parrots, other kinds of creatures do all kinds of incredible cognitive stuff. And if we can pull our heads out of our behinds for a minute, we can recognize that maybe we should have an ethical system that accords them moral significance and moral standing. Okay, so what does it mean then to accord moral standing to a non-human animal? It doesn't just mean leaving them alone, right? These folks who are trudging up from Honduras and Guatemala because the United States supported military dictatorships in their country, and they're incredibly poor and they're trying to escape all the violence in their country. We don't just have the obligation to say, sorry, you can't come in, or shoot them at the border. We have an obligation to help those people if we can, right? And part of helping them is helping them to make decisions for themselves, judging whether we can provide them the refugee status that they need. Now, similarly, you have a chimp in a cage, and you have a child with Down syndrome or with some disease, say severe diabetes. You have a kid with diabetes, and you have a drug that cures his diabetes. You have an obligation to make that kid have access to the drug so that he can overcome his diabetes. I would argue exactly the same thing about Downs. This is where it gets a little controversial, but cognitive disabilities, most people have no problem with the idea that you should never make a child cognitively disabled. And on those grounds, I think one can say, if you're a parent and you have the ability to both prevent and cure a cognitive disability in your child, you have an obligation to do both, right? If your kid is diagnosed with PKU at birth, and all you have to do is keep them away from phenylketonuria food substances to make sure that they don't end up with a cognitive disability, you have an obligation to do that. Similarly, if you're told your kid could be cured with their cognitive disability, could be cured if I give them this pill, I think you have an obligation to do that too. Now, you're a zookeeper and you have a chimp who displays almost all human characteristics, cognitive, moral characteristics up to about the age of a 3-year-old human. And what obligation do you have to that creature? I think you have an obligation, when we do have cognitive enhancement capabilities, I think we have an obligation to that creature to provide those drugs or therapies. Now, do we have a similar obligation to go out and round up every chimpanzee in the world and force them to take these drugs? I'm willing to concede that that's not yet a legitimate prospect, although gene drives and other things we might do could have that kind of consequence. Really, as we've seen with the Planet of the Apes movies, might have some negative consequences too. So I think, yes, we have obligations to those creatures, and it doesn't go all the way down to rocks. So we have to say, at what point does our obligation to other species in the animal kingdom change? And as I said, I follow the dictum that it's personhood and suffering, that we have an obligation to all creatures that can suffer to not cause them unnecessary suffering, but there can be a balance of suffering. I still eat meat, unfortunately, but I'm willing to go to synth meat as soon as it's available. But I still eat meat because I downgrade this to the moral significance of the suffering of a chicken compared to the pleasure I get as a human being. It's questionable calculus, I know. But when I get up to, I would never eat a dolphin, I would never eat an elephant, I would never eat a human, et cetera, because they have different moral significance. And just exactly on those grounds, I would say those creatures have we have the same obligation to them of enabling their ability to get smarter and make their own decisions as we do to children.
I find this idea of animal uplift extremely interesting, but I'm honestly not sure how I feel about it. I think that any line you draw over which we uplift the animals and under which we let them be would be completely arbitrary. And I also question whether or not this is placing undue value on intelligence, which I understand is a nebulous term. What I mean by that is perhaps having human levels of what we call intelligence isn't necessarily good for a species' survival. It's our intelligence that is leading us to warm the planet and destroy the ozone layer. It's our intelligence that leads to plastic in the oceans, and it's our intelligence that could lead to the nuclear weapons that destroy our species. Maybe our level of intelligence is not good for life, and if we unilaterally decide to alter other animals, we remove them from the evolutionary path that may actually prove to be more beneficial to the existence of life in the long run. Could the idea of animal uplift be a very anthropocentric point of view?
Well, in terms of anthropocentrism, I think at one extreme you have what I call human racism. Only humans are valuable, and other species are immaterial, and the natural order is immaterial. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have self-hating humans. People who think there's way too many of us. I wouldn't mind if the entire human race was wiped out because we harmed the daffodil. I think there's a position in between there, which is that it's inescapable that only humans, so far as we know, bring value to the universe. We are the only ones who create the concept of natural order. Animals don't give a crap about the natural order. The planet does not give a crap about the natural order. It just things happen. And we came along and we said, oh, wait, we've got these grand ideas about the way things should be. And we liked the daffodil, and now there's no more daffodils. And therefore we think, oh, should we hate ourselves? We are the only ones who create those values, right? So in the end, for me, if there's a choice between human beings and the natural order, I pick the human beings. But I think that there's an intermediate position, which is human beings want the natural order, and we depend on the natural order. But we should take responsibility for the fact that we can't just withdraw and retire from the natural order. We have been changing the natural order. We are in the Anthropocene. We need to take responsibility for having created the Anthropocene. When our ancestors first arrived in North America 10, 15,000 years ago, the first thing that they did, all of those natural Rousseauian natives, was wipe out every single megafauna on the entire continent except for the buffalo, and then white people came along and destroyed the buffalo. So I think we need to take responsibility, and that means projects like geoengineering. We have discovered now through science and reason and technology that our science and reason and technology is screwing up the relatively recent but still quite delicate ecological mechanisms that allow us to maintain our current standard of living. And yes, 50 million years ago was a different ecology altogether, but we weren't around then, and adapting to that in the space of 50 years is going to be really hard. So we need to figure out, we created problems with science, technology, and reason. We figured it out with science, technology, and reason, and now we might be able to fix it with science, technology, and reason. And that requires doing something more than just saying, oh, everybody stop what they're doing. It might require something like blowing a bunch of silicate dust into the atmosphere. Does that answer your question?
No, it does. It does. I appreciate that point of view on it. So you had mentioned that you are a Buddhist, and previously you were even a Buddhist monk. I'd love to find out more about what that entailed, but also, what benefit have you received from your practice of Buddhism, and how does it inform your point of view on politics and transhumanism?
Well, the reason I became a Buddhist when I was a teenager was that I was basically having existential crisis, that I, as a secular materialist, you begin asking these questions about why do I believe in anything, the metaethical question. Is there any way to rationally defend any particular value system? And my conclusion then, and my conclusion still, is that there isn't. People like Sam Harris to the contrary. I mean, Sam Harris is trying to square that by saying, well, look, in Northern Europe, everybody's relatively happy, therefore we should all be like Northern Europe, and therefore that's the self-evident ethical value system. It's like, no, if you're in the Taliban, that's not a self-ethical argument at all, right? So I had that meta-ethical existential moment as a teenager, and Buddhism came along and said, look, forget about all the meta-ethics. All you need to look at is your own brain. What is your brain trying to do? It's trying to make you happy. What makes you unhappy? These things make you unhappy. These things make you happy. Eventually, if everybody did this, we might, in fact, all be happier. And that was a sufficiently pragmatic argument for me to start down the Buddhist path. Meditation, of course, central to my approach to Buddhism. And when I got to Sri Lanka, I was trying to put together the social ethics piece because I was working for a Buddhist social ethics organization and writing, when I became a monk, I was writing a lot about Buddhism and feminism and Buddhism and social justice. I think that what happened for me was that the central intellectual move in Buddhism is the deconstructive move. It says, look at the thing that you're believing or holding on to and really look at it. And when you really look at it, it kind of goes poof. And that's the nature of the Buddhist approach to the self, but it's the nature of the Buddhist approach to everything. It's the nature of the Buddhist approach to Buddhism. And that's what happened for me with Buddhism. It's like you look at Buddhism too hard and you realize 2,500 years, 50 different countries, thousands of different competing and inconsistent doctrines. There's really no such thing as Buddhism. I could call myself a Buddhist and believe nothing, or call myself a Buddhist and believe, a variety of that. So I really don't care whether people consider me a Buddhist anymore. I don't believe in reincarnation, a number of other doctrines other people hold on to. But that I consider that a very Buddhist move to say, hey, I don't believe in these things that you're holding on to. So that's the two things. I've written an essay, for instance, for the Transhumanist reader about personal identity. A lot of transhumanists walking around, they would really like to be immortal and as they say, drink beer at the death of the universe, the heat death of the universe. But they don't think about what it means to just live a normal human life, much less a million-year human life or a million-year life. What would it mean in terms of your sense of personal identity if you were able to suppress memories, add memories, share bodies and personalities, transform yourself radically into silicon and back into meat and then back into silicon? The whole concept of personal identity begins to fall apart. So Buddhism, I think one of its greatest contributions to the future is going to be to say, look, everybody, stop freaking out about authenticity, about whether if you take an antidepressant, you're still the real you. There is no real you. So just stop freaking out about that. What you really need to pay attention to is, does it move you forward in the way that you want to move forward? Are you moving in the direction of happiness and flourishing, or is it holding you back? That's the only real criteria for moving forward, because there's no real you.
So it seems that one of the benefits you receive from Buddhism is mindfulness, and the meditation plays a large part in that. Many people I admire speak highly of their meditation practice, and it's something that I would like to consider doing myself, but I'm not really sure where to start. Do you have any tips or suggestions for that?
Well, there's a lot of fantastic apps out there today, and I've tried a number of them. I'll tell you, it's really hard to meditate when your life is in disarray and when your brain is in disarray. After the election, it was really hard for me to get on the cushion because I would start immediately thinking about, how we're all going to end up in Guantanamo Bay and how the stormtroopers are going to be at our door any day. So, and people who have actual mental illness, really hard for them to meditate. People who are too ADD. So I think this is one of the cyborg Buddha questions, is like, what is the judicious way to combine ways of tweaking the brain so that you can get into the place where you could sustain an exercise practice? So, if you're a 400-pound person, it may be impossible for you to start an exercise regime that would really get you to where you want to go. But if you got a lap band and you started losing some radical weight and you got down into the 200s, then you might be able to have an exercise program. So there's a kind of feedback loop between our technological enablements and our own self-effort. I'm not looking for a techno fix to spirituality or to anything else. I think it's an unfortunate consequence that some people use techno fixes to make up for things they could fix relatively easily with lifestyle changes. So if you're only sleeping 4 hours a night and you're eating Cheetos all the time and you're drinking too much, trying to meditate may be a little harder than it should be because you're not living right. So I don't want there to just be techno fixes out there. But if you're depressive or you're ADD, or you're just an ordinary human being who finds it totally freak out when you actually look at what a crazy mess your brain is, which is what everybody experiences. Everybody sits down and you go, oh my God, this is just, as we say in Buddhism, drunken monkey stung by bees. So how could I possibly try to tame this beast? So yes, I think mindfulness is a perfect example. It's obviously something everyone should try to persist with, but we also need to figure out how to get people to be able to actually do it. And self-control and certain other personality characteristics are clearly related to the success of a meditation program. And so we need to figure out how to massify and democratize this.
We've talked quite a bit about your involvement with left-leaning politics here in the United States, but recently there's been a lot of talk about transhumanist politics. There's the Transhumanist Party that Zoltan Istvan founded, there's the Transhuman Party, and a few others. What are your thoughts on transhumanist politics?
I was very disappointed that people who had, for instance, signed the Technoprogressive declarations the year before immediately turned around and tried to organize under the banner of transhumanism. As I told them at the time, and I think history has borne out, transhumanism is way too thin a set of agreements to organize a political party around. The best you could probably do is have a transhumanist pack. So this year, the transhumanist issues are deregulating access to cognitive enhancement drugs and having a more liberal policy around CRISPR. Okay, fine. And there could be Republicans and Democrats or, Christian Democrats or whatever around the world who might sign on to that. And you could have a truly bipartisan transhumanist pack as long as you focus really, really narrowly on those issues. But if you try to organize a political party, God bless the Pirates Party. They have a very narrow political agenda. But for an ordinary political party, you have to have a position on foreign policy. You have to have a position on taxes. There is no transhumanist position on 99% of politics, right? Transhumanism only applies to a very narrow brand of issues. Now, the techno-progressive brand, for me, has always been a broader set of things. It is claiming a whole wing of the Enlightenment, which has given us progressive politics today, and saying, remember, everybody, that this wing of the Enlightenment does not see human beings as the enemy or human reason as the enemy. It sees us as problem-solving monkeys that we might be able to figure things out with science and technology. I think that's a coherent thing in order in which to build a broad political party, or at least a political intervention into party politics. So I was very disappointed that people decided to try to wave the transhumanist flag, and they immediately discovered what I'd said, which is that, oh, you got a fascist at a meeting, and you've got a libertarian at a meeting, and you've got a socialist at a meeting. What kind of party are we going to build? None, because that's not going to work. So I think there is a future for techno-progressive politics, whatever we call it in the future, cyborg socialism or whatever. But I don't think there's any future for transhumanist politics qua transhumanism.
We've been using that word transhumanism for the entire conversation, but we haven't really supplied a definition for it. So when you talk about transhumanism, what are you referring to?
Transhumanism is, the way I usually frame it briefly, is that it's an ancient set of aspirations that human beings could be healthier, could live longer, and could be wiser, have expanded cognitive abilities. We used to try to fulfill those aspirations through ritual and herbs and prayer. And then the Enlightenment came along and said, guess what? There's this thing called reason, science, and technology, and we could do it through that means instead. And people signed on to that. And then they started to think about, well, what would a future look like in which we did all that? Well, it would have no more disease, and maybe death would be optional, and maybe we would all be super smart, and maybe we could get rid of work, and maybe we could get rid of all kinds of oppression and slavery. So the kind of ethical and democratic aspect of it as well. So it has a pedigree that is mixed up with and overlaps with fundamental Enlightenment ideas. And trying to figure out how narrow or broad you want to define it has been one of the challenges. If you define it very, very narrowly, it's just the techno-optimism and the individualism of the Enlightenment. If you define it more broadly, then you have to say, well, what about these political economic ideas? Is it more the libertarian economic strains that we think are consistent with transhumanism, or is it more the egalitarian strains? And that's where I think we're at the stage we're at today, is that we have to go beyond just saying, transhumanists are just people who agree that the future is going to be bright and everyone's going to have access to super pills. We have to say, what kind of access to super pills? Who's going to have access to super pills? How are we going to tax that? We have to figure those questions out.
I find it very interesting that you view transhumanism as an extension or evolution of Enlightenment values and ideas. Are there any Enlightenment thinkers or perhaps other writers and philosophers that have influenced your thoughts on this or that you feel show early transhumanist ideas?
Absolutely. I mean, Condorcet, I think his essay written while he was on the run from the Jacobins in France, he was a French revolutionary, and he wanted to write an encyclopedia of the future of the human race. And he started to write it while he was hiding out. And he wrote the introductory essay on what he saw as the trajectory of the French Revolution, even while he was being hunted by tyrants. And what he said in there was, I think we're going to get rid of all slavery. I think we're going to liberate women. I think we're going to we'll liberate ourselves from the church and have a secular republic of some kind. And then after that, we'll probably get rid of disease and death and work. And I'm like, dude, I'm with you. 1776, I'm right there, or whatever it was, 1779, right there with you. So we have forebears like this. I think, the women forebears as well. I mean, Mary Wollstonecraft, her Frankenstein, all these kind of cautionary speculative fiction writers were forebears. The techno-optimism of a lot of the Marxist movement was a kind of forebear and led to various strains of technological thinking in the 21st century, like J.B.S. Haldane and Julian Huxley, who coined the term transhumanism, who were all Marxists. So I think we have a lot of forebears in the tradition who are trying to figure this out, and we need to claim them and celebrate them. One of the things I'm disappointed with in the Humanity Plus is that they took the tradition that we had of giving a J.B.S. Haldane Award and an H.G. Wells Award and just threw it in the trash can because they didn't like the left-wing pedigree that we had pointed to.
As we wrap things up here, I'd love to know what the future holds for you and your organizations. What can we expect from IEET and your other projects?
Well, I have to pull the trigger and finally publish the final distillation of my cyborg Buddhist stuff. I've been working on it way too long. Published a lot of stuff about it in various places and put a kind of précis of the book on a website. But finally need to get that book out the door. We just got a large bequest, and we'll be starting a new program of activity in the IET around human enhancement and artificial intelligence regulation and effects on society. And so we'll be making announcements about that hopefully soon. And as I said, we have had this turn. IET is regulated as a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, so we can't directly engage in partisan political activity or lobby for any particular piece of legislation. What we can do is say, look, around the world, people are talking about X idea. These are the solutions that they're offering, and maybe we should all be thinking about moving in that direction. That's something that's totally within our wheelhouse. And so we have a technoprogressive policy project that's been on the back burner, but now will come to the fore at the IET that hopefully will be pretty inspiring for folks. It's basically, we would like to write a kind of global technoprogressive policy handbook. And then in terms of technological unemployment, I think that this is, along with universal health care and the longevity dividend, technological unemployment is going to be shortly upon us. I mean, the sugar rush that Trump's tax cuts for the rich have provided and all the corporate buybacks that are buoying the stock market, this is all going to come crashing down very shortly. The last time it crashed in 2008, we saw one of the slowest recoveries of jobs that had ever been in a recession. And that's precisely because we're aging as a population and technological unemployment is beginning to be felt. And at least it's contributing to the widening of income disparities in society. So I think very shortly, already polls show that a majority of Americans and a lot of people around the world are beginning to project, well, I know my job could never be automated, but that guy over there, his job's definitely on the chopping block because, I'm sure a robot could do it better than him. And once this actually kicks in, even if it's true that there's new creative economy jobs that you're going to be able to be a fluffer for robot, actors or whatever, I don't think the average 50-year-old truck driver who loses his job to a self-driving truck is going to be able to retrain that quickly for that economy. The last time we went around this, it took 100 years to transition from agricultural to industrial labor. So I don't think we're going to be able to do it in 10, 15 years. There's going to be a lot of discontent. The global rise of fascism is already tied to, directly the districts in Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania and other states in the United States that switched from Obama to Trump, who fell for the fascist hucksterism, were precisely those that have been most affected by automation. You see the same dynamic in Europe. Next time around, it's going to be way worse. So, as we say on the left, socialism or barbarism.
Well, I look forward to Cyborg Buddha finally hitting the shelves. I've been looking forward to that book for a long time. At least the last few years, I'm looking forward to checking it out.
Me too.
I will put links to the rest of those resources as well in the show notes at futuregrind.org. And thanks, James, again for coming on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for the invite, Ryan.
Hey, everyone. Ryan O'Shea again, and thanks for listening to my interview with James. Remember to check out the show notes and more at futuregrind.org. Make sure to subscribe, leave a review. You can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. We also need your help to keep this podcast running. Just go to futuregrind.org/support. Till next time, this is Future Grind.